Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you guys are at. I hope you're having a fantastic day. It's SoulSaint here, and we're continuing off our Hydra 101 series, and today's head is none other than Blight. So Blight is a easy yet frustrating head that actually makes the other ones a little bit harder, and the reason why is because of some of his kit. And just to give you a heads up, we're going to do it like how we did other videos, the two that we've done before, which was the Head of Decay and maybe the Head of Mischief. If you haven't seen them, you can go take a look at those whenever you got a minute. But in particular, the Head of Blight is annoying because of the debuffs he applies to you guys, as well as the buffs, the one buff that he gives to everybody, including himself, and what that buff has to do with it, you know, what's going on with it. So we're going to break it down. We're going to talk about his kit. We're going to talk about the different rotations and how that will affect your run in terms of affinity differences. And then on top of that, we'll talk about some ways to counter the Head of Blight, utilizing maybe some specific key champions that you may have access to. So with that being said, let's talk about his kit. He has Dripping Jaws, which is his default ability, attacks all enemies, places 3 5% poison debuffs for 2 turns, also has a 75% chance of placing a leech debuff for 2 turns. So he's poisoning you. He's providing leech so that the enemies that are hitting you are going to heal up and sustain themselves. It's kind of annoying, right? And then whenever you're decapitating him, he inflicts damage to all heads under HP burn whenever the head is decapitated. Remember how we talked about how poisons kind of fall off, but HP burn kind of seems a little bit more significant? This is one of the reasons why. His A2, or his second ability, Leeching Blight, attacks all enemies, places a 5% poison debuff for 3 turns, and then instantly deals damage from all poison debuffs on each enemy under a leech debuff. So kind of like synergizing with his original ability with the leech and poisons, right? Kind of seems to have some synergy there. But that's not really the most issue, like the biggest issue there. It's really Blinding Smog. So Blinding Smog, what we call Poison Cloud, it places literally a poison cloud on all Hydra heads. This ability cannot be removed, it cannot be transferred, it can't be nothing, right? That particular ability goes onto all heads for 2 turns, which basically means that while that poison cloud is active, and I'm not sure if they talk about it in the description, which is kind of a little bit of a disservice, but poison cloud, what it does, it basically gives a protective barrier in a sense, not like in the sense like how the egg or the life barrier from Decay works. It's more so like it's a buff that kind of would be like the equivalent to block debuffs. So like any on hit debuffs that you try to apply will not work. And the reason why is that also as a part of it, you're much more likely to weak hit as a result of Poison Cloud being on that particular, you know, head, whether you're targeting Mischief or Decay or you are targeting Blight itself. You're a lot more likely to weak hit as a result of that, which results in whenever you weak hit and you're trying to apply a debuff that's an on hit proc, it will automatically fail because of weak hits, right? And that just means your ability to lock down the other heads that are also kind of obnoxious to be a lot more difficult in a sense, right? So the only way that you'll be able to get to it is by champions who apply debuffs without actually doing on-hit damage. So there's no need to worry about weak hitting, right? It's just automatically go on. I'll name like a couple off the bat, like Geomancer, for example, applies his HP burns through his A3, which doesn't do on-hit damage, so it can go through the Poison Cloud, whereas Mishinaki's A1 that applies HP burn is an on-hit based damage application of that debuff, which means that it's much more likely to fail as a result of, you know, Poison Cloud being in play, right? Now, before we go into any other specifics, Almighty Blight, which is his passive, we're going to keep kind of moving on a little bit. This head receives double the damage from HP burn, yet again, another reason why HP burn is starting to become a lot more prevalent, especially in the later portion of this game, right? And it also decreases the damage of all Hydra heads, all the damage that Hydra heads take from AoE attacks by 10%. So another mitigative passive that basically means that your AoE damage is lower than what it was before. So something to keep in mind. Doesn't mean you shouldn't necessarily avoid AoE damage altogether. It's just one of those extra mechanics that you have to kind of play with that number management in mind, right? Believe it or not, AoE HP damage or AoE damage is still not bad in Hydra. It just tells you that the amount you're going to do is automatically at a substantially reduced range, right? Which is, in this particular case, 10%. So, damage from skills that base off of enemy max HP or HP burns or reflect damage or mastery procs like War Master, Giant Slayer have limitations as well, like all the other heads do. You know, 10% count for enemy max HP. HP burn poison tick, or HP burn ticks only go up to 40,000 damage, so it doesn't exceed that. And then, of course, the other mastery procs that we were talking about only go up to 50,000 HP. So another way of like mitigating the amount of output you get from those little outlets are also kind of brought down a little bit. But you know, it's definitely kind of noteworthy that like HP burn happens to be maybe the exception in terms of that regard, but in terms of the amount of output you get, right? Now, it's also immune to stuns, freezes, sleeps, provokes, block active skills, block passive skills, fear, true fear, poison, and petrification. I mean, the list is right there, right? Any exchanging effects or you know, turn meter manipulation is also something that's not relevant in this particular fight, which is why you see like turn meter reducers become less like prevalent or non-existent in compositions for Hydra, whereas like there's other outlets that you can kind of enable. So like still your turn meter enabling champions like Hydra, like Arbiter, excuse me, for example, may see some value here and there, but in terms of like turn meter manipulation, you see that less of a value in Hydra, right? Because they're immune to it, right? Now, how do we manage and deal with this head? Well, first and foremost, we have to be aware of each of the different types of rotational affinities we're going to deal with. Believe it or not, and this actually kind of caught me off guard, majority of the Blight in terms of rotation, so like rotation 1, 3, 4, and 6 are all magic based. And then on top of that, 2 and 5, which is the only ones that are left, is force face. There is not a single spirit affinity head of Blight. And I was caught off guard about that, and I was like, you know what, that's interesting. Now, why is this important? Well, if you're trying to apply debuffs, like how I said in the previous videos, using a spirit affinity against a magic affinity type champion means that you're automatically playing at a deficit. You're more likely to weak hit, you're less likely to crit, which means that if you do so happen to weak hit, you're less likely to land that debuff, which may be key to keeping lockdown, you know, for your team, right? So what are we looking for though if we are talking about debuffs? Well, to start it off, in terms of poisons and leech and debuffs just in general going against you, one great way I look at mitigating that is through cleansing, right? So you have your cleansers. We talked about a couple key champions that played some value in a sense, like Ugo, for example, who provides that cleanse. You know, it does the heal reduction, which is relevant for decay, but also removing one random debuff from all allies, which could happen to be that leech or that extra poison you're receiving, right? In tandem with healing the champion. So Ugo standing out yet again. Another reason why you can see some value from this particular champion is that magic affinity. She's neutral affinity to, you know, stage or rotations 1, 3, 4, and 6, right? Whereas now, this is a key thing, force affinity, she is a little weaker too, so maybe rotation 2 and rotation 5 you consider an alternative measure, and we're going to talk about that. Now, another reason why there's also some value there, we talked about how the head of Blight is providing that poison cloud. Well, you don't have to worry about poison cloud if they can't take that buff, right? It's a buff at the end of the day. Well, block buffs is actually very, very valuable in that aspect, right? So Ugo shining yet again, providing a lot of substance, not only from a decreased defense standpoint, but block buffs kind of becoming a little bit more of a focus point for one of the more important debuffs in the game to have in that fight, right? In addition to that, though, I am going to throw you an audible, and we're going to do something a little bit slightly different here. In terms of champions that provide some substance from a block debuff standpoint, remember how we talked about there was 2 force rotations, you know, force second rotation of rotation 5? Well, what about going positive affinity against that particular type of rotation? Well, Archbishop Pinthroy. He not only provides block buffs across the board, increased accuracy, so you're letting your debuffs a little bit more, and then on top of that, too, the heal reduction, it's less valuable in this particular fight. Now, if you do so happen to have a champion that gives you continuous heals, and I'm going to give you an example of this one not too long from now in terms of like cleansing, maybe if that heal, you know, that heal increase or that increased, you know, health buff that you get from maybe a Tahanarek, for example, having heal reduction now, even in the event that Mischief steals it and spreads it, mitigates the amount of input you're getting back from that buff. So it's like less of a downside from it, right? Yes, they're going to get the buff, but they're not getting any heal from it. So there's some value there, right? In addition to that, healing all enemies, or all their, sorry, not all enemies, healing all your allies, and then placing buffs on them makes you a little bit more valuable in that regard too, with shielding, so basically more survivability. It's more of a utility style, I'm trying to keep my team alive type kit. And then, of course, transferring random debuffs from this champion to the target. Now, this actually becomes a little bit more valuable because you can transfer the poisons you get to maybe a target of your choice, right? Where you get some value of like that poison that was being applied to you, or that leech that was being applied to you. Instead, you're like, shoot, have it back. You know, you give it back to him. So, like, Panther kind of has a little bit of something that makes him a little underrated in that regard, right? And then, of course, any decreased defense and weaken buff debuffs that he gets, he removes at the start of this, you know, at the start of his turn, right? in tandem with being a aura-based champion, which means he can go in lead role if you so happen to be interested, right? Now, we didn't mention a continuous heal from Tahanarak. Tahanarak actually is kind of staple for this particular fight, too, as well, when it comes to block bust, right? Decrease attack, block bust. You know, having a debuff spread, allowing you to basically project all the debuffs that are like, maybe you have one particular head that's like full debuff heavy, and then you start spreading it with Tahanarak, right? Which all happens to include that block buffs, right? So there's some value there in terms of that, and as well as the decreased speed and keeping your team alive. And then the big kicker is random debuffs being removed, which turns up to 2, which is a slightly better version to another alternative, which is going to be another chance the champion we'll talk about, which is less likely to be involved in your composition, but maybe a smart, like an alternative nod, right? Tahanarak, though, staple. She's one of the ones that does it, right? 2 debuffs if you got allies that are under continuous heals. And you know what? You know, when you have downtime on your kid, you're going to be spamming that A1, which means that Champion 1, Champion 2, Champion 3, they're going to get their continuous heals eventually, which means that instead of 1 poison you're getting rid of, you're getting 2. Maybe that leech and then a poison, or you know, maybe whatever else you're getting, like a provoke or something that comes from a different head, right? So, like, she's actually very, very valuable. Now, the epic version of her, which is slightly weaker, yet still of noteworthy, would be our girl, Doom Priest. She actually is one that does the exact same thing in terms of cleansing. She only does 1 buff, though. And then, of course, she comes in with a static heal by 7.5% of their HP. So you can't scale that heal off of anybody else, but each individual champion will get their own 7.5% HP restored, right? She does provide increased attack, as well as an increased crit rate on a chance proc, whereas the increased attack is guaranteed to go for every 3 turns. She is a force ally speed increaser by 15%, so if you are pretty force heavy, I don't recommend it, but it is a champion that you can potentially use that will give you that benefit. You know, that's one way you can kind of get through those poisons, right? So it's less damage you're taking as you're cleansing and going along. Now, another way that you can also do it, and this is a more accessible champion that everybody can get eventually as you're farming through Hydra. I keep bringing it back to her, but she's the gift that keeps on giving, right? Removing all debuffs, Mithrala, yet again, you know? You're looking for those type of things, removing all debuffs, right? Strengthen, shields, the whole 9 yards. We talked about her in the previous video. She shines it again in this example in terms of removing the damage aspect behind what Blight does, right? She's also Void Affinity, so that makes it a little bit better too, right? Now, in terms of another way you can approach getting rid of the damage output that comes from Blight, which is basically the debuffs, can be block debuffs. And I have to kind of give this as a caveat. We talked about the Head of Mischief not too long ago about how he still buffs, and this is a dangerous concept to have to play around, right? Because if you so happen to use someone like Pythion, for example, who uses block debuffs, you'll cleanse everybody, you're removing all the debuffs, and you're cleansing and you're healing, right? It's great, and now that whenever any other debuffs try to come in, you block them, but you are opening the door for, like, Mischief, for example, to maybe snatch that and give that to the enemy team, which means that you're not putting debuffs now, and that's difficult, right? So it's good to conceptually be aware of the other heads and what they're doing, while you're also providing mitigation or enabling or disabling the enemy, right? That's one way you could do it, and any type of block debuff champion will do, or any type of cleanser will do, but you just got to be aware of that concept of if you're introducing block debuff to your team, that you are opening the door to potentially losing that buff and having that buff be used against you, right? So with that in mind, you want to be careful, and that's where block buffs also comes into play a lot more. We talked about Ugo. I'll give you another example of one that was a part of a 7-day login for those that were around long enough. Deliana, her A3, not only heals you for each block buff that's applied on the enemy, but you also apply that block buff, right? So it's really, really good. If it's resisted, it speeds her up a little bit, so you're getting some value no matter what if it's landing, but ideally you want this buff to land, right? So she was one that I've actually recently built up that I'm actually working towards developing that I think will contribute another layer of accessibility or a little bit of control for your team. She also provides leech and some decreased resistance, and although decreased resistance is a little bit less valuable as a debuff, it may help you for that one particular champion that's like, you know what, he was built as like your mischief tank, you know, high resistance, but he's a little lacking in that accuracy. I mean, one champion that comes to mind that I'm working with conceptually that I have that problem with would be like Coronar, is, you know, my go-to provoker slash mischief tank, right? So like I'm looking at, you know what, I forced a lot of resistance into it. Maybe I'm slacking in accuracy. By decreasing the resistance means that you need less accuracy to land it, right? So there's value there, right? The key thing though is just being aware of the concepts of, or the heads that are working around you, while also managing each one specifically, right? So it's a combination of finding a multitude of champions basically that do multiple things, right? And some of the ones I mentioned are very, very valuable for you. Now, with that being said, once you have block buffs up, you can do it as this, like whenever a head spawns or whenever a head despawns, so that like they don't get that poison cloud, and in case Blight's about to get their turn. Block debuffs or cleansers is a great way to manage the output that you're getting from the Blight head, which means that it's a lot easier for you to lock down, right? So it's very, very good in that regard. Now, I will also throw in Unorthodox, and I'll be honest with you, I probably wouldn't use this as a guaranteed focus, or like I wouldn't dedicate him towards operating within Hydra exactly, but maybe finding a champion similar to what SoulSaint does in his passive, where he redirects poisons. Instead of it even landing on me in the first place, it's going to go straight back to the attacker, right? So you may get some value there. Although, like I said, you're looking for champions that do a bunch of things in different areas, and he in particular would only be a direct conflictor with the Blight head, right? So it's a little bit less value in that regard, but it is something worthy of note, right? He does come in with decreased speed, as long as the enemy whose attack is equal to or lower than their defense, and you may see a couple champions do that. For example, I'm looking at the Head of Decay, who has like 5k, 5.5-ish k attack on normal, right, with 2.5 defense. So like that decreased speed is gonna land, right? You know, the decreased crit damage, which means he's doing less damage to you. You know, like those are some values. But to be honest with you, outside of those two abilities, or the passive in this ability, his A3, you may see like his value not be exponential in Hydra, where he's more suited in other areas, right? But I did want to like point out like areas where you see poison and the manipulation of poison, or the usage of poison, and how you can play that into your advantage, right? Cleansers, debuffers, you know, basically block debuff champions in general, so that you can kind of avoid the poison debuffs altogether, or the leech debuff altogether, and you just kind of thrive, basically, is the long and short of it. This is one of the fairly easier heads to deal with, which is why I thought, you know, we dealt with two of the most annoying ones, or / difficult ones. Now we kind of ease it up a little bit and show you one of the heads that are a little bit more easier to manage. And with all that being said, finding the right composition is going to come with a multitude of different, you know, trial and error issues that you may occur. Of course, finding the speeds and the resistances. I did want to show you guys this as well. So on rotation 6, I'm going to work my way from 6 upwards as an example, or just in general from like normal to like hard, or nightmare for that matter. The Head of Blight is actually not that resistant, you know. You only need 125 accuracy on normal, whether his accuracy is also 220, so it's not too high in that regard, right? So for your champions, if you're looking to land stuff on them, as you go up, it's 175 for hard. For brutal, you're looking at 240, so that does jump up a little bit, right? And then, of course, Nightmare is another big jump, where you're looking at 320 accuracy. So, like, those are some important keynotes to keep in mind when you're trying to land that block buff, or if you're trying to land that hex, or the extra little bit of debuffs that will enable your team to do better, right? You want to keep that level of accuracy minimum requirement in mind. And the same thing is true if you really think that like resistance would help you sustain through this fight a little bit more. Then his accuracy is around 330, which means that you're looking around like 435 resistance to mitigate that, and that's on the minimum side. So of course, you know, Nightmare, brutal, hard, normal will all have varying difficulties and different stats, which you'll have to adjust around, right? With that being said, I hope you guys enjoyed this video. If you have any questions, comments, concerns, if I missed something, please feel free to let me know. And as always, guys, don't forget to subscribe. Forget about that. You know, we appreciate you guys. You know how it is. We're almost at 500, so definitely help us out. With that being said, though, always remember, stay ascended.
Got the